Hi, ladies and gentlemen. This is our personal video over the analysis section of the paper. I've already done one over the narrative portion of the same paper. This is Kelly Henning's Big Steve, and I'd just like to go over the analysis section for a few minutes here, give you an idea of what you're supposed to do. So the analysis is supposed to be a paper where you show how your narrative is demonstrative of larger issues at stake. And you use it as a springboard for launching into conversations about those issues and utilizing the articles and resources that we've read or encountered in this unit, in the gender unit or the class and race unit, and tying it to your personal narrative. And so there is going to be some I and my. When you reference your narrative, you are going to have some concrete details potentially from your narrative, but you're also going to have some quotes or concrete details from the various different articles that we've read over these two units. You're also going to try to open it up beyond your experience and explain how your experience fits into the bigger picture. So let's dive into Kelly's here and get a little bit of a sense of what she's doing. So here's her introduction. Growing up, I had always thought of the portrayals of sexual harassment in movies and shows were simply fictional stories that did not actually occur in day-to-day life. As I grew up, I began to realize more and more the extent to which unwanted attention is received by women at the hands of men every day out in the world due to the objectification of women in modern media. Despite this realization, I did not fully understand how uncomfortable and terrifying these instances of sexual harassment were until I experienced it firsthand at Kansas Sampler. So let's pause there and just talk about what she's doing. So the first few sentences are establishing where her thought process was in relation to the actuality of the issue. And even though she realized it was a problem, she didn't understand how crazy it was until this story. And so that's how she leads us in. That's some context of her thought process. Continuing. The feelings of helplessness I felt at the hands of Steve left me shaken and deeply uncomfortable. I have gone to school with teenage boys every day for the last 6 years, so I was no stranger to sexual harassment prior to the incident at Kansas Sampler. But to be objectified to such an extent by a man so much older than me was like nothing I had ever experienced before. Modern media representations of women lead to their constant objectification, unwanted sexual harassment, and a lack of willingness to shut down advances for fear of an aggressive response. So she brings in her narrative, and then she dumps into a thesis. Now, one thing Kelly could have done to improve this essay is to have an actual transition between her experience and the larger picture thesis. It kind of comes out of nowhere. But if she added that, this would actually be a really productive paragraph or introduction that sets up the essay really well. Let's go down to our first body paragraph and just take a look at that for a second here. The objectification often experienced by young women at their first jobs is a direct response to the representation of women in the media. Advertisements, movies, books, and TV shows containing young, beautiful, docile women are not even remotely hard to come by, and this portrayal is affecting how women are seen and treated by men. In all forms of modern media, women are shown almost exclusively as housewives or sex objects. As Steve requested that I pick out his sweatshirt for him, he emphasizing that he would not buy it unless I chose it, he was applying the typical portrayal of a housewife to me. Steve's assumption that I should be the one to pick out his clothes, as many men let their wives do, stems from the common television mom, concerned only with her husband and children, leading no life of her own. So Kelly is attempting to apply this quote from Kilborn, an article that we didn't read this year, but one that's useful here, to what's happening in her narrative. And she cites a specific time in her narrative that is an example of that. And she uses that as a springboard into some commentary tying those two ideas together. Let's scroll down to page 7 here and let's continue. It is not uncommon for a customer to come in and ask for assistance in finding a certain type of shirt, but Steve's insistence that I had to be the one to choose his clothes transformed me from a worker at a clothing store to an object there only to serve, obey, and make his life easier. Steve also applied the common portrayal of women as sex objects to me when he suggested that I join a sorority after discussing how many great-looking girls his son dated while in a fraternity. Steve's persistence in persuading me to join a sorority stemmed not only from his assumption that I was a sexual object made for men, specifically those in fraternities in this instance, but also the notion that I should want to make myself available for consumption. The sex object portrayal represents women as mannequins and shells, incapable of any attribute other than beauty. So here she goes into a second set of concrete details and commentary, and she's really blending really well here as she's highlighting things that happen in the narrative, but she's not just summarizing those things. She's talking about how those things fit into her topic sentence about how women are portrayed as sex objects. And she brings in another, and Maurice is yelling in the background, so I hope this helps you with your video, but this is another tie to a great quote from Kilbourne, and you can see that she has kind of an indirect quote plus a direct quotation here that all goes together. Continuing, Steve thought of me in the same context when he assumed that my primary motivator in decisions regarding my social life in college should be how easily I can make myself available to men. The idea that my only interest in college would be meeting men perfectly illustrates how the modern representations of women in media turn them from people into objects for consumption. Whether it be as a housewife or sex object, most women are viewed as less than as actual people than as an accessory to at least one male's life, thanks to modern media. And again, we kind of end out on a typical 2 lines of commentary and 1 concluding sentence, Schaeffer paragraph format. The rest of the paragraph is kind of Schaeffer-esque, but it really blends that concrete detail and commentary in the middle. Let's go to the next body paragraph. It says, in today's world, it would be almost impossible for a young woman not to experience any type of unwanted sexual attention by the time they are 20 years old, especially if the woman has any employment experience prior to reaching adulthood. While Barry Deutsch notes in his checklist of male privileges that the odds of him encountering sexual harassment on the job are so low as to be negligible, this is not the case for women. As a young woman who has not yet reached 18, I have held 2 part-time jobs and experienced more than a handful of predatory men, both at my job as a lifeguard as well as at Kansas Sampler. As teenage girls age into young women, simultaneously beginning their first jobs, men begin to see them less as people and more as objects for their consumption. In a satire piece posted on The Onion concerning the objectification of women, a female high school student's history teacher recalls one of the brightest and best students in his class before a transition from an honor roll student and sentient human being into a lovely piece of meat. So Kelly does a great job here of talking about her broader experiences. You'll notice that her experiences as a lifeguard don't appear in the narrative, but they're relevant to the analysis and they add more context and power to her message. Then you'll notice that she references the Onion piece about the objectification of women that we read, and she does note that it's a satirical piece. You don't want to use that particular item without saying that it's a satire because it's so over the top, but it does highlight a kernel of truth that is trying to exaggerate for effect. Let's continue. This same kind of thinking extends to young women who, instead of being seen as a human being simply trying to do their job, are viewed and treated as a piece of equipment for the, often older, male's entertainment and enjoyment. As I tried to help Steve find a suitable sweatshirt for his needs, I was viewed less as a person and employee of the store and more as an object for him to play with and enjoy. While ignoring my abilities to perform my job and provide the service he was there for, Steve instead focused on my physical attributions, reducing me to little more than a toy. As women reach the typical age for first-time employment, they also reach the prime age for objectification, leading to countless experiences of sexual harassment in the workplace. So Kelly really moves well beyond her experience to talk about how this affects many different women, and that it's unfortunate that women kind of come of age to a place where many men tend to start objectifying them at the same time that they're put into these employment roles that makes them kind of vulnerable to what Steve did to her. Let's continue on. Now remember, your analysis only has to have 2 body paragraphs. When Kelly wrote this, she had to have 3. So this is a bonus paragraph, but I think it's really strong, and so I want to go over it. Not only are young women faced with objectification and unwanted sexual advances, but also the challenging decision of how to react to each of these. The common portrayal of women as submissive beings in media provides no standard protocol for rebuffing advances or contradicting men, and doing so can be a frightening experience. One norm of Western masculinity is aggression, leading to combative responses from men when women are not the docile, peaceful beings they're always portrayed as. I really like where Kelly expands this, not only talking about the Big Steve's inappropriate behavior, but also acknowledging why she was kind of stuck and unable to be assertive and make that behavior stop. And so, one of the things you might think about when you're writing your own analysis is that maybe you have one paragraph on one side of the situation, in this case, the male side, and then maybe another paragraph on the female side of the situation. And in Kelly's case, she kind of blends both, but I really think that this makes it pretty dynamic. And so, if you're talking about, let's say, a story of privilege versus with a culture shock of poverty, obviously you can compare and contrast those with two-body paragraphs. Continuing. One example of this phenomenon is Anita Sarkeesian, a feminist culture critic who has received death and rape threats from opponents of her recent work challenging the stereotypes of women in video games. The way in which Sarkeesian was targeted after contradicting the typical stereotype of the docile woman who does not challenge norms established by males, in this case in the video game industry, illustrates the type of response many women fear when considering shutting down sexual harassment. This fear, combined with my uncertainty about how to continue to do my job and put a stop to the harassment, led to my inaction in the situation with Steve. I feared a hostile reaction from Steve, who was over 6 feet tall and had already been exhibiting aggressive behavior. The panic I felt at Steve's sexual harassment was the same emotion I felt during every experience with sexual harassment I've had while at work, and could be eliminated with more representation of independent, thoughtful, and outspoken women in modern media. And this should be women, not woman. But this paragraph does a great job of really navigating the issues at hand and how they play in the bigger picture with her narrative and her experience. Finally, the conclusion. Modern media portrayals of women as either a housewife or sex object lead to the continued objectification of women. Steve's insistence that I picked out his clothes for him and also joined a sorority in college exemplified these stereotypes. By asking me to choose a sweatshirt for him, Steve was assuming I was just another female object there to serve him. The assumption that I should want to join a sorority in order to meet men in college also serves to represent me as an object for male consumption. This objectification, along with my young age, made me the perfect target for sexual harassment at Steve's hand. Unable to rebuff any of his advances due to fear of aggression, as is common with women receiving sexual harassment, I was forced to conform to the modern representation of a serving and unquestioning young woman. In order for young women like myself to break free of our current objectification and sexualization, modern media must provide more examples of confident, unafraid women for men and women of all ages to learn from. More positive representation of multidimensional women will provide a new context to think of women in, encouraging more respectful interactions between men and women. I like how this conclusion takes a lot of the ideas and talks about how maybe we could make them a little bit better in the future. I think that it's a really useful tool in your conclusion to kind of look forward and think about, man, if we made some of the changes and we really acknowledged the problems, maybe this would be the result. And that's a way maybe to avoid kind of what Kelly did in the opening parts of her conclusion, where she just merely summarized. I think by the end, she's breaking free of that, and she's not applying new information because it is a conclusion, but she's at least looking at it with all of the information she's already said in mind and giving the reader something to think about as they leave the essay. Let's look at the Works Cited page really quickly, and you could see we've got the hanging indent. Things are in alphabetical order, and of course she took these citations off of the citation page that I provided, that I'll provide you, and she has Works Cited at the top. It's got its own separate page. No bold, no underline, nothing special with the Works Cited except that it's centered, and it continues her page number and last name. This concludes our video over the analysis. I hope this helps you out. Of course, you always can email me at prhamilton@usd232.org or see me in class or during study hall seminar to get a little bit of help. Thank you.